I've always been fascinated with the Himalaya. I spent some time there as a kid. My father used to work in the Himalaya. And it is the largest physical feature in India and is responsible for the climate of North India, as well as essential for the livelihoods of about a billion people that live in the Indo-Gangetic plains due to the ecosystem services provided by it. Biodiversity, species, animals, plants don't recognize political borders, and they move whether the borders are there or not. What's interesting is that people also don't recognize political borders to the extent that we might think they do. The indigenous groups there will often cross borders which are thought to be extremely hostile and disputed without really thinking too much about it. Borders have become a lot less porous than they used to be, but the movement across borders still occurs, both for the flora and fauna, but also for human beings, and a certain amount of trade that still goes on. The Himalaya has often been studied for the north-south transects, the very, very sudden changes in elevation from about sea level to 8,000 meters or more in a very, very short distance. However, what's equally interesting or more interesting, and what we are looking at through the Yale Himalaya Initiative, is the east-west arc or the east-west transect from Afghanistan and Pakistan in the west to Burma in the east. And along this gradient, you have a large variety of environmental, social, and cultural gradients. You find the entire spectrum of religions. Most of the major religions of the planet are well represented in the Himalaya. It's unusual to see such a small area with all these various religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, coexisting and coexisting fairly well in many places. The Himalaya is also the sort of land from where many major rivers flow, and 10 major river basins get a lot of their water from the Himalayan region, and the ecosystem services that flow from the Himalaya impact about a fifth of humanity, over a billion people in the Indo-Gangetic plains, in the plains of Punjab, and further north in Tibet and China. They're a young and growing mountain range, which is very fragile, where many of the rocks tend to be very crumbly, where seismic activity is already very high. So it's not a very stable mountain range, such as the mountain ranges, such as the Alps, for example, which tend to be an old and stable mountain range. The high population that has been living there has resulted in the fragmentation of the natural areas. And as global warming occurs, and global warming, interestingly enough, seems to be occurring faster or at a more accentuated rate in the Himalaya. The glaciers seem to be melting a little faster. The climate change across the slope seems to be higher. It is impacting the way the natural flora and fauna can move, especially now that human beings have sort of taken over patches of the landscape, and the corridors for migration of that flora and fauna have been greatly cut down. So the Himalaya faces threats on several fronts. Another major one is the development activity. We all want electricity, and so hydropower needs to be built. But is hydropower, are large dams or even run-of-the-river dams appropriate for the Himalaya? There's a lot of road building activity going on without proper alignment. Once you disturb a fragile rock, it's often very, very hard to stabilize it. And roads that are built incorrectly will result in landslips and landslides that go on for years to come. The Himalaya makes an extremely interesting research area. And in some ways, it's easy to study. The tree diversity, for example, in the Western Himalaya is relatively low. But what makes it so interesting and complex is the interplay of nature, geology, ecology, forestry, and human beings. Unlike other forested ecosystems in the world, you don't have large swaths of forest and then human populations on the periphery of that. Human beings integrate very, very well with the natural areas. They're dependent on the natural areas of these forests, and pretty much all the forests are impacted by human beings in one way or the other. Studying this interplay of humans and nature and wildlife is extremely interesting.